Claire. Thanks, Tony. As Claire alluded to, the main reason I'm here today is that we've been doing a lot of work with employers around race over the last 4 years, but more recently in the last 16 months, it's perhaps crescendoed a wee bit. And I said to Claire, look, we're doing this work with employers. We also regard our union colleagues as very important. And I felt it was a good thing maybe to update you on some of the work we were doing, but from the perspective of trade unions in terms of how it might help you or keep you informed. So I don't have slides because I'm going to really jump all over the place in 30 minutes. So I didn't think it was worth having slides. So I've got a couple of disparate issues I'm going to cover. And this is really about giving you an update about where we are in the Equality Commission vis-a-vis the race work. Now, clearly, we have the executive back. We have a race strategy which covers up to 2025. That there may be changes there. We had proposals previously about the introduction of gender pay reporting in Northern Ireland. And the proposal here was that it was going to be extended to disability and race. And there is some outstanding employment legislation. There's also anomalies between equality and employment law legislation between GB and here, which are very concerning. And from the equality perspective, not just in race, but other areas, we've asked for the introduction of a single equality bill, which would reflect the one that they have in GB, in the sense that, given our legislation is different in relation to things like fair employment, we would have one piece of legislation where everything was contained within it. So with that kind of proviso, what are the main things that have been happening? Well, the first thing was the census data. And the census data, when it was introduced, showed that over 3% of our population came from Black and minority ethnic communities. Now, a number of people, we ran an employer roundtable with the TEO, and one of the issues that arose was this number. And quickly it became apparent that this number of, I think it's just under 4%, did not include, very often, migrant workers from Eastern Europe who were white. So when you, and we didn't do this work, Alfie Wong from TEO did, when you combined the BME, Black minority ethnic groups, and people from Eastern Europe, broadly speaking, we had a migrant worker population of about 7.9%. That's a significant increase on the last census. And this number is particularly high in certain parts of Northern Ireland, as you have gathered. And that tends to be around areas where migrant workers come and they work. So there's a big population in Newry and Portadown, Mid Ulster, because of the meat factories principally. And that's of interest. That's kind of the demographic that we're beginning to see. We also then did some research broadly to see what the effect of Brexit was in relation to race. And we discovered some concerning things. But as I mentioned to Claire earlier, many of these were issues that you picked up, Congress picked up. And I know Kevin Doherty was involved in the research several years ago. So the research we did really reflected what you had found. And what we did was we conducted this research amongst employers, but also groups who represent migrant workers and so forth. And what we found were a number of things. First of all, we found that there, surprisingly so, there was still a lot of racial discrimination. There was still a lot of racial harassment. And also there was a particular focus. So we found there were particular concerns we had around employment agencies and their engagement with migrant workers. So there were things happening that shouldn't be happening, but we also found employment agencies coming to us and explaining in some cases they didn't know what their responsibilities were. So that was a big issue. Now, as a result of that, a month ago, we ran an in-house webinar just for employment agencies in relation to race equality in Northern Ireland and the specific issues we identified in our research and the need for employment agencies to do better.
We were very surprised. We got 17, most of the big ones, who came along. We had a very, it's an informal, in-lodge discussion, and we identified for them what they perceived to be the challenges that they faced. We discussed what their responsibilities are, because unbeknown to many of them, they do have very, very significant responsibilities in relation to the employment of migrant workers, which some of them were not aware of. We also discussed the need for proper procedures and practices for recruitment agencies in terms of their engagement with migrant workers, and how they could address the fact that they were responsible for the employment relationship between the migrant worker and the employer, that they had a responsibility there. The second thing the research identified was significant problems around race in the agri-food industry. And here, this was not just Mid-Ulster, but the problem was around agri-foods. Now, that included predominantly meat factories, but mushroom factory, bird picking, and so forth. And the issues that arose there were the same issues as your research identified. Very concerning issues around racial discrimination, racial harassment. And the type of racial harassment was the type that you would not expect to get in 2024. It was the type of racial harassment you would have seen here back in the 1990s. So very oblique, very obvious racial harassment was happening. There was also a lack of provision around having proper policies and procedures in place. There was no, for example, very little equality monitoring. And if you don't have monitoring, you cannot identify the nature or the extent of a problem. Sometimes you don't even know if there's a problem if you're not monitoring. And also, you cannot determine whether the strategies you put in place to address race discrimination are working or not. So as a result of that, in March, I think it's the 6th of March, we're running a webinar for employers from the agri-food sector to look at what the major problems are in relation to equality for migrant workers in that sector, and to develop proposals on good practice and legal practice. So we'll be explaining to them what the law requires from the perspective of race discrimination, but also talking to them about good practice. So that's going to happen. The third sector, and I'm sure you can imagine, where we found significant evidence of racism, was in the care sector. And as a result of that, we're working very closely with that sector. And to begin that work, we're going to be doing an initial webinar with them, and that probably will be in April, early May. So out of this work, we'll be combining the feedback from these sessions and then feeding them into our business plan considerations for next year. But what this work shows very clearly is that racism is alive and well. It's predominant in certain industries, and it's predominant in certain ways, depending on the culture. And the solutions are the same as they have always been. And I'll touch on that in a moment. So that's the research that we did. And that's the result of what we've done with it. And clearly, a lot of these workplaces are unionized. And you may find yourself engaged, particularly in the agri-food sector, with some of the companies who are attempting to put in place basic legislative provisions or to promote good practice. Now, that's not to say that they are the only sectors where there is issue of race. If you follow the settlements that we do and the cases we support, we've had a number of race cases in recent years that have not happened exclusively in those sectors. So that's where the evidence is most predominant, but it's not to say racism it does not exist elsewhere. It's a wee bit like sectarianism in that sense.
which of course is still here and is still very relevant. In terms of other issues, what are other issues? Because of the research we did, we've updated our guidance on monitoring race at work. And I sent Tony the guide, and Tony has sent that out to all of you. Now, this new guidance explains why employers should monitor, but it also gives them a template to use to actually monitor, so that you can literally lift that template and use that to monitor race. So if you're negotiating with an employer or you're trying to work with them, that guidance would be very useful in that sense, because monitoring has always got to be the beginning of addressing any equality problem, because you've got to know if there's a problem. You've got to know the nature of the problem. That informs the solutions, and then you need to assess whether what you're doing is working. So that is important in that sense. But also, we have developed an updated race equality plan. And again, Tony has sent you a copy of that. And we launched this plan last year as part of our race work with 100 employers. We're pushing it constantly. And the race equality plan, it is designed for employers to do two things: to meet their basic legal requirements. So that means to prevent direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, harassment, and victimization. But for the more progressively minded employers, it allows them to promote good practice. So to go beyond the law and to promote good race practice beyond what's legally required. And interestingly, we are getting a reasonably decent take-up of that. And there are a number of reasons for that. One is the extension of social value legislation, which puts an increased onus on private sector companies who want to access government contracts to do more to address the issue of people who are marginalised from employment, or who historically have been marginalised from employment. And marginalisation in employment isn't just about not being able to get into employment. It's also about being stuck, as it were, in low-paid, low-skilled jobs. So that's important. So it's about. I lost my train there because somebody was trying to set up a meeting with me. But basically, the social value legislation is an important factor. Something else that's happening, which is quite interesting in relation to race, is the introduction of the City Deals policy, which is a UK initiative, but we have for Belfast City Council. We're very involved in that, and we drafted the essentially what are equality pledges for Belfast City Council in relation to their city deals. So they've developed a charter, as it were, of pledges in relation to areas like employment law and environment, social cooperation and equality. And the promotion of race, and not just race, disability and sex, but the promotion of good practice race equality is central to the City Deal work. It's a very popular initiative with employers. Currently, it's limited to Belfast, but it's becoming a driver of the race agenda. The next thing I wanted to mention to you is that what are the big issues in race that are happening that we're seeing in the workplace? Well, one of them is some employers insisting on the use of English whilst employees are at work all the time. And we had an interesting settlement a number of years ago where an employer had required that all employees speak English all of the time when they're at work. Now, that was shown in this case, that was not regarded by us as a reasonable thing for the employer to suggest. Now, if, for example, however, you're working in a hospital, you're a nurse and you're working with patients, well, yeah, I mean, we could see a reason why employees would have to speak English in the context of doctors and patients and so forth. But we didn't see why in all cases employees had to speak English. So that's something to be conscious of, which we're beginning to see, that some employers are introducing this blanket requirement. Depending upon the industry, the place of employment, the relationship at work, the service user, it's not always acceptable. And an employer would need a very strong justification to introduce a policy like that. But it is also fair to say that basically bog standard racial harassment is still an issue. Literally treating people less fairly because of their ethnic origin, their skin color, using derogatory language, making racist comments whilst at work, that is still an issue. And to address that, the answer is fairly simple. That requires education, but in situations where particularly offensive language is used, it really requires an employer policy and procedure to make sure employers deal with issues like that and that they become unacceptable at work, so that people don't even think about making these comments and remarks. And there is an issue there about employers having effective policies on dignity at work and harassment and bullying. But there's also an issue about employers ensuring that they implement their own policies, that they don't pay lip service to those policies. So they may have a policy that outlaws harassment, but you've then got to make sure that you implement it and you do it effectively. And they should be working with trade unions in relation to this, because the support of trade unions in a workplace is imperative. If the employer wants to try and change the culture of a workplace, and it goes back to the fair employment days. Government knew then that if you wanted to maximise the impact of that equality legislation, it was much more effective if unions were working with the employer. And the race issue is no different, because again, in that case, you're trying to create an inclusive culture where there are certain behaviours that are acceptable and there are certain things that are not. And to change the culture, you need all the players who have some authority on side and basically pushing the same message. And that's why, for us, unions remain extremely important in terms of dealing with race. I wanted to just maybe finish by telling you about the Commission, the Equality Commission. We've made a number of proposals to government in relation to the race relations order in Northern Ireland. You'll probably recall that we got race legislation here 20 years after GB. And the legislation we have now is not as strong as they have in GB in terms of race. That also covers and extends to other equality areas, by the way. So we've made a number of recommendations to government, basically saying that we need to see the race legislation here strengthened, at least so there's parity with Britain. And just for your information, some of the big issues there are, first of all, we want to see the extension of race, of what is race, because race, the definition of race around colour and nationality here in Northern Ireland is much narrower than in Britain, where they consider it to be race, to be colour or nationality, ethnic origin, nationality, caste, all those things. So we want to see the legislation here being extended to cover those areas. The second thing we want to see is much greater protection where people are harassed because of their race and perhaps some other issue, because that can often be the case, that people are harassed not just because they are Black or from Pakistan or Chinese. It's also because maybe they're a woman or whatever, or disabled. But certainly the link there exists between race and sex. So it's important to provide extra protection for people who are discriminated for several reasons. The third issue is we want to see an end to some of the exemptions, because in Northern Ireland it's possible for an employer to be exempted from the race legislation. For example, under something called Article 40, an employer who discriminates against an employee in relation to activity about collecting immigration data is legally justified in doing that. So they can discriminate, and they will be protected by law if they discriminate against someone on the basis of racial background where the job relates to immigration. So we want to see things like that going. And we would also like to see a tightening of other exemptions which exist in relation to race. We also want to see the extension of monitoring. And you might be aware that the TEO in their own race strategy several months ago did themselves say that they wanted to see an extension of race monitoring. Now, this is principally in the public sector, and it relates principally to Section 75. Nonetheless, it increases the pressure on others to look at race monitoring. And we would like to see that pressure increased so that there is more of a focus on monitoring race. And that's where social value comes in. And we'd encourage employers, particularly in the private sector, to look at race monitoring where they're anticipating going for public sector contracts. We also want to see greater protection against third-party harassment. So that would be, for example, if you have a worker at work, maybe a delivery person or someone who's out in the community, and they're harassed by a service provider. There is no protection. There is some legal protection under employment law, but we need to see much greater protection under equality law. That's something else. And we also want to see an extension of positive action in relation to disability. And because the disability, we want to see an extension of positive action in relation to race. The positive action provisions under race are not that different from sex, and they're not particularly strong. They're nothing like, for example, what we have under disability, where you can have guaranteed interview schemes, you can reserve jobs. Now, we're not calling for that necessarily, but we do want to see a strengthening of the current provisions around positive action to facilitate people from Black minority ethnic communities getting into employment and getting the support they need when they're in employment. And that's the final point, that I wanted to make, that when we're now working with employers in relation to race, and fully enough, this applies to sex, to disability as well, but we're talking about race this morning. One of the issues that is arising is that even where employers are effective in getting people from minority ethnic communities into work, there's then a problem of retaining those people in work. Because those people come in, and in terms of race, very often low paid, low skilled jobs. The culture of the workplace hasn't changed to reflect the fact that employers are now trying to employ groups previously marginalized. So you come to work and the culture is not an inclusive culture. And people feel uncomfortable because of the culture, the values, what goes on a day-to-day basis, the norms, the typical behaviors, and the person feels excluded and they leave. So this is becoming a big issue for employers, and it's not just with race. It applies to any marginalized group that they're trying to get into employment. And they are trying to do this because they, in many cases, cannot get the people they want. So they do the effort to get people in, but then nothing happens to keep the person, and higher numbers of people leave from those marginal groups than from the general workforce. So that's a big issue if you're negotiating with employers. It's not enough to just get proper or decent recruitment and selection processes in place. You then have to have the other policies around flexible working, hybrid working, holidays, leave, performance, that are going to make people feel comfortable in work. So that's the end of the presentation. I've covered all the things I wanted to tell you about. And I just wanted, as I said at the beginning, my main thing was we're doing a lot of work with employers, and I'm conscious of that. And I'm not talking to unions in relation to this work. And I thought, look, let's take the chance just to keep you up to date, at least with what we're doing. And hopefully that's some interest to you, that's some use to you as well.